We're going to be looking at the nature of experience itself, and we're going to be using Michelle Montague's book, The Given, Experience and Its Content, as our guide. And I gotta say, even for folks who are into philosophy, this is a dense one.
It is. I mean, what we're really
Right.
dealing with here is sort of a fundamental question that's always sort of been there in philosophy, going way back. How is it that we experience anything at all? What's the relationship between, our minds and the world around us?
Yeah, yeah. So Montague uses this term, phenomenological givenness. She suggests that to truly understand consciousness, we need to go beyond the surface level and really look at the interplay between two things: sensory phenomenology and cognitive phenomenology.
Right. And for our listener, can you unpack those terms? What exactly do we mean when we talk about sensory and cognitive phenomenology?
Sure, sure. Sensory phenomenology is all about those raw feels of experience. Think about the redness of an apple, the coldness of ice, or the scent of coffee brewing. It's immediate, right? That direct qualitative character of our sensations. Cognitive phenomenology, on the other hand, that deals with the more, let's say, conceptual or thought-based aspects of our experience, judgments, interpretations, and, our thoughts themselves.
So how do these two types of phenomenology, sensory and cognitive, fit into Montague's idea of the given? How does she connect these concepts?
Well, Montague's work is deeply rooted in the Brentanian tradition in philosophy. And one of the key ideas from that tradition is the notion of phenomenological givenness. So, the content of our experience for Brentano and for Montague, it's not simply a representation of the world, it's something directly present to our consciousness.
So it's not just about, like, having a picture of a tree in our mind, but about the actual experience, the act of seeing the tree with all those sensory details and the thoughts it evokes.
Montague, though, she expands on that traditional Brentanian view. She argues that the content of experience goes beyond just these phenomenological features. It also includes the external physical objects themselves. For her, we're directly experiencing things like trees and chairs, not just representations of them.
That's a pretty bold claim. How does she back that up? What's the basis for that idea?
She introduces this crucial concept. It's called awareness of awareness. Her central thesis is that in any conscious experience, right, we're not only aware of the object of experience, but also, and this is key, also aware of the experience itself.
So if I'm, say, looking at a painting, I'm not only seeing those colors, the shapes, but I'm also aware that I am the one having that visual experience.
Exactly. But here's the
Eh.
thing about this awareness of awareness. It's not something we're directly focused on, right? It's more of a subtle thing, a background awareness, what philosophers would call it a non-sophetic awareness.
And why is this awareness of awareness? Why is it so central to Montague's theory? What role does it play in her overall argument?
Well, it challenges those standard representationalist accounts of experience, which were really dominant in philosophy, for much of the 20th century. Those theories, they tend to reduce experience to a kind of, like an internal representation of the world, almost like a picture in the head.
So they'd say that my experience of a red apple, for example, that's just my brain creating this representation of that apple and its redness.
Yes, and that the content of my experience is, well, kind of limited to those properties represented in this internal model. Montague, though, she pushes back on that. She argues that this view misses something crucial, that phenomenological givenness of the experience itself.
So you're saying there's more to experiencing redness than just having that mental representation of the color red. There's something more to it.
Absolutely. That raw feel of redness, the way it appears to me directly, it can't be reduced to any kind of representational content. And, well, this is where the awareness of awareness comes in. By being aware of our own experiencing, we become aware of that unique qualitative character of experience, something that just goes beyond mere representation.
Okay, I see. But this raises, I think, an important question. If experience is so rooted in this subjective givenness, in our own phenomenology, how can we be sure that we're accurately perceiving the world out there? How do we know we're not just trapped in our own subjective bubbles?
That's a great question. And you're right. That gets to the heart of this whole philosophical debate about perception. And Montague doesn't shy away from these questions. Actually, she dedicates a big chunk of her book to tackling these issues head on.
Before we get into those complexities, maybe you could give an example to really illustrate this distinction between the representational and the phenomenological, something concrete for our listeners to grasp onto.
Okay, yeah, sure. Imagine looking up at a blue sky. Right. Now, a representationalist, they might say that your experience consists in your brain forming a representation of the sky's blueness. But that leaves out, well, the subjective quality of the experience itself, doesn't it?
That what is like to see the color blue?
Montague would argue that this, what it's like, is a core part of the content of your experience. It's that phenomenological givenness of blueness that makes the experience, well, what it is. And this givenness, it's something you're directly aware of because of, that awareness of awareness.
So while the representation of blue might be shared by many people looking at the same sky, the specific what it's like to experience that blue, it's unique to each individual.
Precisely. This emphasis on that subjective character of experience, it's a real hallmark of Montague's work, and it's what sets her apart from those more traditional representationalist views. She's not denying that our experiences represent the world, but she's arguing there's more to experience than just representation.
And this leads to another key question. How does Montague explain how we go from this subjective awareness of experience to actually perceiving, understanding the world around us? If experience is so centered on the givenness of our own phenomenology, how do we ever break out of our own head, so to speak? How do we connect with that external reality?
And this is where Montague's account of intentionality comes into play. She argues that while the content of our experience is given phenomenologically, it's also directed toward objects and states of affairs in the world.
So even though my experience of seeing a tree is fundamentally subjective, it's still about the tree itself.
Precisely. Montague, she rejects the idea that intentionality can be reduced to just causal relations or just representational relations. Instead, she argues that intentionality is it's grounded in the phenomenological structure of experience itself.
Hmm. Can you elaborate on that a bit? What does it mean for intentionality to be grounded in the phenomenology of experience? How does that work?
Well, she suggests that the way we experience the world is already kind of shaped by our intentional directedness towards objects. It's not like we first have a purely subjective experience and then somehow project that experience onto the world, right? Rather, our experience is always already world-directed, from the get-go.
So the very structure of our experience is such that it's inherently about something beyond itself.
Exactly. And that's a key part of Montague's response to that challenge of how we get beyond the privacy of our own subjective experience. She's arguing our experience isn't trapped inside our heads. It's already reaching out, engaging with the world.
That's really interesting. It seems like Montague is offering this really nuanced view of the relationship between experience and the world, one that recognizes, both the subjective and the objective dimensions of perception. It's not an either.
You've got it. Montague's work is all about finding a balance between those two seemingly opposed poles. She wants to preserve the richness, the immediacy of subjective experience without, falling into the trap of solipsism.
So how does she navigate that? What are the specific mechanisms or processes she uses to explain how our subjective experiences connect with, that objective world out there?
And that's a great transition because that takes us right into the next part of our discussion. We're going to dig into Montague's specific arguments about perceptual content, her critique of standard representationalism, and her alternative account of how our experiences manage to refer to those objects in the world.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. I'm really eager to hear how Montague tackles these really fundamental philosophical problems.
So let's delve a bit deeper into how Montague tackles this question of perceptual content. How our experiences actually connect with that objective world out there.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that Montague, she challenges those standard representationalist views. Can you maybe unpack that a bit more? What do those views actually entail, and why does she find them, well, inadequate?
Sure, sure. So standard representationalism, this was like the dominant theory in philosophy of mind for a good while. And it basically proposes that our perceptual experiences, they're essentially internal representations of that external world. So the content of our experience, according to this view, is determined by the properties that are represented in these internal models.
Okay, so if I'm seeing, say, a red apple, my experience is just a matter of my brain generating a representation of that apple. It's redness, and that's it.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And this representation, it's what, mediates our access to the world. We don't directly perceive objects. Instead, we grasp them through these intermediary representations.
And it sounds like Montague takes issue with this picture. What are her main critiques of this standard representationalist account? Where does she see it falling short?
Well, one of her central critiques is that It fails to capture like the full phenomenological richness of experience. It kind of reduces experience to a set of abstract representations, and in doing so, it strips away that subjective qualitative dimension that's so central to, our conscious lives.
She's arguing that there's more to experience than just having a mental model of the world, like there's something more going on.
Exactly. She contends that what it's like aspect of
Hmm.
experience, the raw feel of seeing red or hearing a melody, it can't be fully captured by any kind of representational content. These objective qualities, they're directly given to us in experience, and that's thanks to that awareness of awareness we talked about
Right.
earlier.
So for Montague, the content of experience, it includes both representational elements and these phenomenological qualities.
She's not denying that our experiences, they represent the world in some way, but she insists that there's more to the story than just representation. That phenomenological givenness, that's a crucial part of the content of experience.
And this leads to, I think, another key critique Montague raises against standard representationalism. It's this idea of the transparency thesis. Can you explain what that is and why Montague finds it problematic?
Right. So the transparency thesis, this is often associated with standard representationalism, and it claims that we're not directly aware of our representations, but only of the objects that they represent. It suggests that our access to the world is, kind of transparent, unmediated by our own mental states.
So when I'm seeing a tree, I'm not aware of like the representation of the tree in my mind. I'm just aware of the tree itself.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is our representations, they're kind of invisible to us, like a window through which we see the world. But Montague argues that this thesis, well, it's empirically implausible and, just phenomenologically inaccurate.
How so? What makes it implausible?
Well, she points out that, we are often aware of our own perceptual processes,
Right.
especially, when things go wrong, when they go awry. Like in cases of illusion or hallucination, we can become aware of those discrepancies between our experience and the actual world.
So if I'm seeing a mirage in the desert, I become aware that, okay, my experience isn't accurately reflecting that external reality.
In those cases, we become conscious of the fact that, hey, I'm having an experience that is distinct from the object that it's supposed to represent. And this awareness, it challenges that transparency thesis,
Yeah.
suggesting that we do have some access to our own representations, even if that access isn't, always explicit or focal.
And Montague also introduces this concept of phenomenological content to further, I think, distinguish her view from standard representationalism. Uh, can you explain what she means by that term? How does it fit into her overall theory?
Sure. Phenomenological content, according to Montague, it refers to that subjective, qualitative character of experience, the what it's like, to have a particular experience. This content, it encompasses not just sensory qualities like, color, shape, but also those cognitive features, things like thoughts and judgments.
So while representational content might capture the objective features of the world that our experience is about, phenomenological content is capturing the subjective character of the experience itself.
That's a great way to put it. Montague argues that, while all phenomenological content is representational, not all representational content is phenomenological.
Could you give an example to maybe illustrate this distinction, make it a little more concrete?
Yeah, of course. Imagine you're listening to a piece of music. Now, the representational content of your experience, that might include things like the melody, the rhythm, the instruments that are being played, that content, it's about those objective features of the music itself. But your experience also has this phenomenological content, right?
Hmm.
It's the unique way that music sounds to you, the emotional response it evokes, the thoughts and associations that it triggers, that kind of thing.
So two people could hear the same piece of music. They could agree on that representational content,
Yeah.
but have very different phenomenological experiences of it.
And that highlights the crucial distinction that Montague is drawing. She's really emphasizing that subjective, experiential dimension of consciousness, something that often gets overlooked in those traditional representationalist accounts.
Right. And this distinction, I think, it's really crucial for understanding her overall project, right?
Yeah.
It suggests she's not just offering like a different theory of representation. It's more like she's rethinking the very nature of experience itself.
She's not content with reducing experience to, set of internal models or representations. She wants to account for that richness and complexity of of our conscious lives, the way that our experiences are just, imbued with subjective qualities and feelings.
But this focus on the subjective, it seems to raise some concerns about, well, skepticism, right?
Yeah.
If experience is so grounded in our own phenomenology, how can we be sure that we're accurately perceiving the world? How does Montague address that potential challenge?
That's a key question. And, Montague doesn't shy away from the challenge of skepticism. She acknowledges that our experiences can be misleading, that, we can misperceive the world, that our judgments can be fallible. But she argues that skepticism of this sort, it's ultimately self-defeating.
Oh, so in
Yeah.
what way?
Well, she points out that any argument for skepticism, it has to rely on, some form of experience or reasoning itself. If we're going to doubt the reliability of our senses, we need to have some basis for that doubt,
Right.
right? And that basis can only come from, our own cognitive faculties.
So to doubt everything, we'd have to doubt the very tools we're using to doubt.
Exactly. Montague suggests that a radical form of skepticism, one that denies the possibility of any knowledge, well, it becomes incoherent. To make sense of our experience, we kind of have to start with this assumption that our cognitive faculties are generally reliable, even if they're not infallible.
So it doesn't mean we can never be wrong, but it does suggest that, we have to trust our cognitive abilities to some extent if we're going to, make sense of the world at all.
Right. Montague isn't offering like a naive realism that claims our experiences perfectly mirror reality. It's more like she's advocating for a critical realism, one that recognizes the potential for error, but also acknowledges that that general reliability of our perceptual and cognitive faculties.
And that critical realism, it seems to strike a nice balance between the extremes of naive realism and, and that radical skepticism. It recognizes those limitations of our experience while still allowing for the possibility of genuine knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. Monty's approach is all about finding that middle ground,
Yeah.
acknowledging the complexities of experience without falling into either dogmatism or despair.
This discussion of skepticism and realism, it brings us to another key concept in Montague's work, the notion of object positing.
Hmm.
Can you explain what she means by that term? How does it relate to her overall theory of perception?
Yeah, so object positing, for Montague, it's the cognitive process by which we experience the world as being, composed of distinct objects. It's the way our minds kind of carve up the continuous flow of sensory experience into those discrete, individuated entities.
So it's not just that we see shapes and colors, but we actively organize those sensations into the perception of a unified object, like a tree or a chair.
Montague argues that object positing is it's a fundamental cognitive act, a way of structuring our experience that goes beyond beyond the mere reception of sensory data. It involves a kind of conceptual understanding, a grasp of the idea that that the world is made up of these objects that have distinct boundaries and properties.
In this object positing, it seems to play a pretty crucial role in bridging the gap between our subjective experiences and that objective world out there. It's the way we move from the givenness of our phenomenology to the perception of things beyond ourselves.
You're exactly right. Object positing it's a key part of Montague's account of intentionality. It explains how our experiences manage to refer to specific objects in the world, even though those objects aren't given to us, directly in sensory experience.
Can you maybe elaborate on how this object positing works in practice? What are the mechanisms by which our minds construct these objects out of, the raw data of sensation? How do we get from one to the other?
Well, Montague suggests that object positing involves this complex interplay of sensory and cognitive processes. It starts with that basic ability to discriminate between different sensory qualities, to see edges and boundaries, to track the movement of objects in space and time, that kind of thing.
So we need to be able to differentiate between, say, the visual experience of a tree and the background sky before we could even begin to posit the existence of a distinct object.
That basic sensory discrimination, that provides the raw material for object positing. But it's not enough to simply detect those differences in sensory input. We also need to apply conceptual categories to grasp the idea that certain collections of sensory features, well, they belong together as a unified whole.
So we need to bring our conceptual understanding of what a tree is to bear on our sensory experience in order to perceive a tree as a distinct object.
Montague argues that object positing is not it's not a purely bottom-up process driven solely by sensory input. It also involves those those top-down conceptual influences that shape how we organize and interpret that input.
And this interplay of sensory and cognitive processes, that seems really crucial for understanding how our minds construct this coherent picture of the world. It's not just passively receiving information, but it's about actively shaping and interpreting that information based on, our conceptual understanding.
That's a key insight of Montague's theory. She's emphasizing that active role of the mind in perception, the way our cognitive faculties shape, the world that we experience.
And this discussion of object positing raises I think, a fascinating question.
Yeah.
How does this process work in those cases of illusion or hallucination where our experiences don't accurately reflect, that external world? How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of some of the philosophical challenges um, surrounding perception and reality. Montague argues that even in cases of illusion or hallucination, object positing is still taking place.
So even if I'm hallucinating a pink elephant, my mind is still
Yeah.
like constructing an object, even though there's no real elephant there.
That's right. Montague suggests that the mechanisms of object positing, they're not dependent on the presence of a corresponding object in that external world. It's a fundamental way our minds structure experience, regardless of whether that experience is, veridical or not.
So that suggests there's um, a certain autonomy to our cognitive faculties.
Montague's work really challenges that traditional view of perception as a passive process of just receiving input from the world. Instead, she emphasizes the active role of the mind in constructing the world that we experience.
And that idea of the mind as an active participant in perception, that seems to have some pretty profound implications for how we understand, the relationship between that inner world of experience and external reality.
It certainly does. Montague's work invites us to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about how we perceive and understand the world. It suggests that the world we experience is not simply given to us, but is in part a product of our own cognitive activity.
So we've been delving into, Montague's critique of standard representationalism and her focus on that subjective, that phenomenological dimension of experience. But how does she actually address like this really fundamental question of how our thoughts, how our experiences connect to specific objects out in the world? How do we get from, our inner world to those things out there?
Yeah, that's where Montague, she takes on this classic philosophical problem of intentionality, how our mental states are about something beyond themselves. And she really dives into this thing called the access problem. It asks how do our thoughts actually manage to refer to or latch onto particular objects in the world? It's a tricky one.
Right. So if I think that cup over there, how does my thought like actually connect to that specific cup rather than any other cup?
Yeah, precisely. And traditional theories, they often try to explain this connection through, causal chains or contextual factors, maybe descriptive content. But Montague, she argues that these accounts, while, they're insightful, they don't fully capture that phenomenological dimension of access. She suggests that intentionality, it's not, merely a matter of these external relations. It's grounded in the very structure of experience itself.
Hmm. Can you unpack that a bit? How does she see intentionality as being grounded in experience?
Well, she proposes that the way we experience the world, it's already kind of shaped by our intentional directedness towards objects. Our experience isn't this neutral, passive reception of data that we then, interpret or project onto the world. It's inherently structured in a way that makes it about objects and states of affairs.
So the very nature of our experience is that it's always already pointing towards something beyond itself.
She argues that our perceptual experiences, they have this kind of built-in aboutness that's not reducible to any, external relations or causal connections.
This sounds really intriguing, but also maybe a bit mysterious. Can you give an example to illustrate how this built-in aboutness actually shows up in our experience?
Okay, sure. Think about seeing a tree. Now, according to Montague, it's not as if we first have this this purely subjective visual experience of green shapes and then kind of infer, oh, those shapes, they correspond to a tree.
Right.
Our experience, it's immediately given as being of a tree. The object itself is like part of the content of our experience.
So the tree isn't something we infer or construct, but rather something we directly experience.
That's the core of her argument. She's suggesting that our experience isn't this detached representation of the world, but more like a direct engagement with it.
But if our experiences are so directly about objects in the world, how does Montague account for those cases of misperception, like illusions,
Yeah.
hallucinations, right? In those cases, our experiences, they seem to be about things that, well, they aren't actually there.
Right, and that's where her matching view comes in. She argues that for a perceptual experience to be genuinely about an object, there needs to be this degree of match between the properties the experience represents and the properties of the object itself.
So if I'm having this visual experience of, say, a pink elephant, but there's no pink elephant anywhere around,
Hmm.
my experience isn't really about a pink elephant
Yeah.
because there's a mismatch between my experience and reality.
That experience, it might be, phenomenologically vivid, but it lacks that right kind of connection to an actual object to be considered, veridical perception.
This matching view, it seems to offer a way of kind of reconciling the subjective richness of experience
Mm.
with those objective constraints of the external world. It allows for the possibility of misperception,
Yeah.
but also insists that our experiences need to be grounded in reality to some extent.
Right. It's a nuanced approach. It avoids those pitfalls of both naive realism and that radical skepticism. It finds a kind of middle ground.
Well, Montague's work has certainly given us a lot to think about when it comes to, the nature of experience, the relationship between our minds and the world. What would you say, like, the most significant takeaway is from our deep dive into the given?
I think one of the key insights is her emphasis on this interplay between, sensory and cognitive phenomenology. She shows us that our experience isn't simply, passive sensory reception or just abstract representation. It's this dynamic interplay of subjective qualities and that conceptual understanding. It's both, and they work together.
Right. She's challenging us to move beyond that traditional way of thinking, that dichotomy between the subjective and the objective. And she's showing us how these seemingly opposed dimensions are, well, they're deeply intertwined in our experience of the world.
Her work is really a call to appreciate the richness and the complexity of our conscious lives. She's reminding us that the world we experience, it's not just a given, but it's in part a creation of our own minds. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. This has been such a fascinating exploration of Michelle Montague's The Given. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into her really thought-provoking work. We hope you leave with this renewed sense of wonder about those intricate workings of your own mind and how it connects with that world around you.